ever-growing impact and importance of platform business models, regulation and competition are actually, competition law have become real topics, and we all know about the discussion around data privacy. Our platform regulation panel will explore the latest thinking of EU and UK policymakers and platform leaders. We are in the extremely capable hands with Lewis Crofts, editor-in-chief of the leading news provider MLex, now part of LexisNexis, who's going to moderate this panel. Lewis, the virtual stage is all yours.
So thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to moderate this panel. This is going to look at the regulatory landscape, which has been in flux for a while. I think it's moved generally from a feeling of, isn't it great to have all this innovation and these tools and products and services brought to our door, often for free, to concerns about the size of some of these companies, to what happens with our data, to access to markets, to market entry and so forth. And this has posed questions for competition lawyers, competition regulators, also for privacy regulators. We've seen GDPR and big leaks hitting the front pages about what happens to our data, but also deeper questions about what it means to be a consumer or a citizen or a business. So it's been a really interesting time for the last 5-6 years, and the panel that we've got should give us some fascinating insights into that. We've got Professor Michael Jacobides, who was mentioned on the previous panel, from the London Business School. We've got Oliver Bethell, who's head of competition at Google, who's lived through some of the major cases of the last few years. And Tom Smith, who's director of legal at Competition and Markets Authority, which is the UK regulator, which has also been at the forefront of some of the thinking on how to handle these questions. What we're going to do is we're going to hear briefly from each of them in that order, and then we'll kick off the discussion. So, Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much. And what I'd like to do, as I am not a regulation chap, but I was drawn to regulation precisely because I think that it is a very important topic that is going to reshape the way that we compete, is share a little bit some thoughts. So whistle-stop tour of what's happening as I've now started getting a regulatory hat as well in Europe. And what you will see is that in 2019, we had a bunch of fairly important studies in the US, the Stigler Center study, the Stigler report. In the UK, we had the Furman report by the Treasury, and in the EU, their own report on digital data. And of course, we started having a number of interesting cases that were either 2019 or 2020, including the big case against Google in the United States, that is starting to say, well, you know what, we have a problem here. And one of the parts of the problem is that the traditional tools that we have don't quite work. So the issue that we've had is that we have seen that that platforms create bottlenecks. And it is easy to see that the traditional companies like Accor that we may teach at, that have 500,000 people, have got less money than the small Amsterdam firm of Booking.com and all of that, because of these wonderful platform effects that everyone here knows. But I think that even more, the concern is the shift in terms of the power of big tech, and the fact that COVID-19, if anything, has increased their strength, certainly as this can be witnessed by their value in terms of market capitalization and the extent of verticals that they're involved in. If we get the time, it'd be fun to speak about how economic nationalism and industrial policy is starting to find an interesting ally with competition policy, but that's a really huge topic of conversation. Now, the challenge, of course, is that traditional tools of regulation have looked at all problems. The canonical problem is, how do I increase my margin by reducing supply? And we can define the markets, and we knew how to do that. And we had all kinds of lovely test snips and the rest of it, and all kinds of technical analysis that have kept competition lawyers and economists happily busy on the courts, making a bit of side money for a long time. Now, the problem, of course, is that many of these things don't quite work when it comes to networks and platforms. Now, in platforms, people said, oh, it's all about network externalities. And what happens is that the value of the network increases non-linearly in the number of people who use it, which is partly right, but mostly incorrect, because people don't really care in most of these platforms whether someone else is on the platform. And then you have all kinds of interesting varieties, same side, other side, and mostly you have much more competition than people would have thought. So if you look at what the evidence shows, having looked with some colleagues in a recent SMR, you look at what happens, and you actually see there's a fair amount of competition. So these platforms and ecosystems, well, some of them never take all, others win it all temporarily, many of them find fork in the road. And this idea that you just get scale and then you own the economy is simply not quite empirically right. So what is this concern about? Well, I think that the concern here is that we do have some issues. Now, there is contestability when there's clever strategy, which is the good news here. So consider what happened in China, for instance. You had the traditional dominant firm, which is Alibaba, second firm with JD.com. Pinduoduo out of nowhere came to challenge the position of the number two. How did they do it? They did it by gamifying the experience of shopping and offering a new value proposition, suggesting that if there is good strategy, there can be some contestability. Now, this is on the good news, but the problem is that we are all starting to be beholden to the devices that we have, and that creates a lot of dependencies. Not only that, but you also have a few very important firms, and I'm starting with the Chinese one just to be politically correct because we speak about the American firms all the time. The biggest IPO that never quite was yet, because the Chinese authorities are starting to get antsy about it as well, which is the Ant Group from Alibaba that tries to envelop everyone. And why is this a problem? It's a problem because all of a sudden we start thinking about how people really shop and how people really behave. So the problem that we've got, that's illustrated by what Dick Thaler, who took the Nobel Prize in economics 3 years ago, said, and these are the 2 quotes that Google gave me when the day that he got the Nobel Prize, is that we're lazy shoppers and there are firms that create the default and the default wins. And that's a problem because competition gets dampened. And now I think the regulators are starting to say, what the heck do we do with that? Here we go to platforms and ecosystems. What's the problem? The problem is that we have companies, the big companies that we care about, that do 2 things. They are multi-product ecosystems, i.e. they bring a number of different products together, and they engage multi-actor ecosystems, i.e. they create platforms through which they find complementers. Why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem because what you want to do as a massive firm is to lock people in, and Google has done it very cleverly by expanding into the combination of things that gives it all the information that it can sell to the people that sell advertising that fill up its coffers by ensuring that you have all of these convenient factors that it can then monetize. And equivalently, Apple says, let me create all these things together. And by the way, the more I broaden this sort of multi-product salami, the more I'm going to be relying on platforms that also have multi-party people. And the stronger that I become in this dimension, the more I can squeeze the other guys more than I actually should. So we now start saying, oh boy, these guys perhaps need to be looked at because they have the power to really, really squeeze complementers and to lock in customers. Neither of the two are good for competition and a number of other topics that we can't quite look at. So now we've got this great new era where we're looking at things like gateways and the gatekeepers, because some platforms and ecosystems are stronger. iPhones. Well, if you've got an iPhone, you're not going to also switch to an Android. So if you're a company like Tinder and you want to have a platform for people who date, you need to do what iPhone says, because otherwise everyone with an iPhone is out of your potential sphere. So you now start seeing the way that the different platforms and ecosystems operate. Some have power, others do not. Unfortunately, Uber or Lyft doesn't. And by the way, all this story about diversification that you heard earlier on, it's not just that they go to another vertical. They try to create the optimal length to lock customers in. And that's why Grab went into financial services in Indonesia and Malaysia, because that was much more sticky than rides. Rides will never pay themselves. A bundle that makes people sticky will allow them to pay themselves. When that becomes a gatekeeper, what's anti-competitive, this is the stuff that is up for grabs. We need to have new tools, which is the fun stuff. We need to have new tools, which is the scary stuff, because we don't have them yet. And we're already speaking about regulating as we are looking at the inadequacies of some of the existing ways that we have looked at the world. So it's fascinating. I think that the reality is, if you look at what's happening in Europe, that the world is changing. There are a number of interesting questions. And to go back to my starting example, the question of scope. Are we okay with these companies that build these ever-growing salamis? Healthcare is the big contested area, and Fitbit and Google is a good example of that as well. You've got the story not only of the platform and the complementers, but also learning about people, and that's AI and its use. Data and its use, absolutely massive in terms of both within and across ecosystems. And that's where lots of the fights are, both regulation and non-regulation. iOS 14, cookieless future, all kinds of fun stuff. Do we allow M&As that suck ecosystems and platforms out, like WhatsApp and Instagram? Should we have prevented that in order to make more competition within it? And should we think that ecosystems like M&A is a way to grow non-organically that should be looked at? So lots of things, I think lots of discussion, lots of metaphysical questions, but also pragmatic stuff that you will hear. So let me stop here after I gave you some sense of the conceptual bit, because I'd like to hear much more from the people who are involved in either doing it, like Ollie, who's going to tell us what the challenges are and how to think about fairness from Tom.
Ollie, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Lewis. Thanks a lot, Michael. Can you hear me? Can you give me a thumbs up? Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for having me here. As Lewis says, I run Google's EMEA competition practice. So I have a bit of experience of the Google cases in particular, and I on regulatory reform, I think is an area where we're paying a lot of attention at the moment. And I'll give you some thoughts on this. I think that Michael actually, as he closes, puts things very well for me. There are two things that I like to focus on in my introductory remarks. First of all, why do I think that this kind of forum is particularly unique and important? This discussion we're having today with the people who are listening to us today. And then I'm going to just focus on two areas where, from a practical perspective, where I would encourage platform owners, platform developers, aspiring platform leaders to be paying particular attention as regulation is formed and it evolves in the coming months. And why is that important? In a nutshell, as Michael quite rightly says, we've done a lot of metaphysics. This kind of forum is a change of scene for certainly for me, and I suspect for my co-panelists. Typically, we're talking about the kinds of regulatory issues that have been touched on by Michael with an audience of competition lawyers and economists. And to be very frank, that is at the metaphysical, somewhat macro level. We talk in general terms about platforms. We talk about certain types of practices, industry level observations. But with the new rules coming, and they are coming, we need to move to the micro. And it is people who are coming together in this type of forum, I strongly believe, who are going to need to contribute to that debate. What will the rules mean in practice? How will they apply to our businesses, to your businesses, to the businesses you aspire to grow? To what will they cost you in terms of product development delay? Legal fees, dare I say, econ, OC fees. Michael quite nicely mentions the side hustle. It's there. How will you manage that? How much regulation will be helpful for you in your business? Where will there be opportunities? Where do you look for the opportunities? Where should the rules focus, and how do we make these manifest? So I think those are all questions that are very, very important. The drafters have the pen in their hand. They're dipping their virtual quills in the virtual ink. We need to contribute. We need to have very specific, fact-specific, evidence-specific discussions about what these kinds of questions will mean in practice. And then I think this, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak here today, because I think this is a great opportunity to talk, as Michael also says, about the details. So 2 areas where, very briefly in my remarks, that I'd like to focus on 2 areas where I think that those of you who are in this position, who are developing platforms, ought to pay particular attention. First of all, who is in scope? This is saying like some glib comment, but it's important. The word platform, if you attend the conferences that Lewis and Michael and Tom and I attend, the word platform is used a lot, but it's a bit like lockdown, right? Everyone uses it, but everyone has slightly different versions of what it might mean. So having a clear concept of what we mean when we talk about platform or gatekeeper or systemic actor or bottleneck, all expressions that are used quite liberally amongst those thinking about new legislation, it is important that we understand what that means, because it will be the entry condition for the new regulatory regime. There is a tendency, I would say at the moment, to talk about what gatekeeper is naturally by reference to a set of particular businesses, because we are aware of GAFA, we are aware of what the big companies are doing. So what's a gatekeeper? Well, it's what those large companies are doing. But as Michael has also said in his opening remarks, those companies operate in various different ways. There are certain parts of their businesses that perhaps do satisfy some of those criteria, some of those traditional criteria that you might think of when you're trying to identify a gatekeeper, others don't. We talk about app stores, we talk about cloud infrastructure, operating systems. So we have some ideas of who is within the set, but I respectfully submit, perhaps a little less work has been done on what are the attributes that give one, the qualify one as a member of the set. Why does that matter? If we know who's going to be in there, why does that matter? Well, this is a snapshot of today. Regulatory reform, the rubber will hit the road in the next couple of years, most likely, and they will apply to the businesses that evolve over the next 5 to 10 beyond. So we need to have a set of criteria that define the access, the access conditions to the gatekeeper rules that are clear, that can accommodate new types of business. There will be some attributes that I think we can probably agree on: size of user base, multi-sidedness, ease of switching. But the question, I think, for you, platform developers, platform owners, aspirational platform leaders, as I say, is whether the attributes that the legislators are considering today are clear enough. Will they give you the certainty for you to understand whether your new invention, your new platform is in or out? If not, do you accept some degree of discretion as people choose who is going to be in or out of this new classification? Point 1. Point 2 of 2. What kind of evidence distinguishes competitive disruption from distortion of competition? Now, again, I think it's very important to speak to people who are building platforms when we think about this idea, because I know for many of you, as with Google, the features that define your platform will not be fixed. And when you think about how you're entering or expanding into different markets, you'll essentially be looking across different feature sets. That's essentially how people move into different spaces. It's not a decision to launch product X and build incorporated into product Y. Typically, these are features that are built on an existing feature set. That's certainly how Google operates. And the hope of all of us is to disrupt, to be quite frank, to bring competition to markets where incumbents are not innovating as quickly as they could be. And the new regulatory frameworks that we're thinking about, that we're discussing on this panel, and that are very hot within our world, the competition community, are designed to filter. They're designed to filter the product decisions, your decision to launch a particular new feature, the type of feature launch that is going to have a detrimental effect on competition from the ones that will not. And I think that raises some important questions for people to consider now. How do we define those trade-offs? What are the types of evidence that are informing your decisions when you think about the trade-offs that lead to a product launch? What kinds of integrations do you think are typically bad? Can we identify those? Is there a way of saying that there are some certain types of things that we would do as a platform owner that on the face of it, we don't need to assess the impact. We don't need to understand what it does or whether there's any justification. We recognize it as being a bad thing. It's a very timely and important question. It's very fact specific. And I think that it is people in this forum who are best placed to answer that with real evidence based on the way that you develop products. I'm going to stop there. That's a very quick sort of the 2 topics I wanted to raise and that I think are very important as we're thinking about how we can provide value in this debate, particularly this forum. Look, I think just in closing, I think it is crucial that we move to fora like this to discuss how the rules will apply in practice. I think it will make the difference between red tape and green shoots. It will mean the difference between successful regulatory innovation and unsuccessful regulatory innovation. And with that, I stop. Lewis, thanks for the time.
Thanks, Ollie. Tom, over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tom. I work at the Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA. And as many of you know, we've been doing a lot of hard looking at digital markets recently. Our remit is to make markets work well for consumers by promoting competition and innovation. Quite right. I'm probably meant to disagree with Ollie more, but I thought he was spot on when he was talking about green shoots rather than red tape. That's certainly what we're aiming at. So I'll give you just a very brief rundown of our work so far. In July, we published a very big wodge of paper in the Market Study Report, which was a report into the ad fund platforms, that's Google and Facebook, to good effect, we think. We used our new data science unit to crunch the data so that we crunch kind of billions of lines of data to really produce some facts where to try and drill down, like Ollie was saying, actually, where previously it was all quite theoretical. What we found was that a company like Google's had huge benefits for society, for consumers, and we certainly do not want to dampen any innovation. In fact, what we want to do is incentivize even more innovation. Michael ran through, I thought, very well some of the concerns that certainly chime with what we wrote about in our report. That we found new challenges, like Michael was saying. Old regulatory price controls are not exactly going to be the way that are going to succeed here. We found network effects. We found a lack of transparency. We found vertical integration leading to conflicts of interest. We found unsurmountable data advantages amongst the platforms. We found barriers to entry. And as Michael said, we found that defaults have a very large power over consumer behavior. So we recommended to government that we set up a new regulatory regime, which is a pretty big thing to be recommending. It's not something we do every day, but we found that these new challenges and existing tools are too slow to prevent competitive harm happening. A big case like one of the Google cases in Brussels takes the best part of a decade to complete. And they cannot intervene before the harm happens. They can only come along afterwards. What we need is a process that can intervene quickly and that can be expert enough to make the complex trade-offs that are involved here. Important considerations rub up against each other, privacy versus competition, or short-term innovation against a kind of long-term level playing field where let the best company win. And if we have an expert body there, we can tweak the remedies over time so they can be properly tested. We can do the A/B testing of any choice screens or whatever. We can collaborate closely with the gatekeepers and with the wider industry. And we can have, like I say, the right people doing it, people who understand the industry. So what did we propose? We proposed 3 limbs, sorry, 2 limbs, and then another one we're considering. The first one is an enforceable code of conduct. So we would designate a platform as having strategic market status only if that platform has substantial and entrenched market power over businesses seeking access to consumers and over those consumers. And it would require the company to occupy a strategic position in the UK economy. Another point Ollie quite rightly made is that we need to be clear who's in scope, who's in the firing line and who's not. One thing that could work there would be a jurisdictional revenue threshold. If set at the right level, that would show that the vast majority of companies would know that they're not falling in scope of this regime. And if set with reference to UK revenues, it could also provide certainty to foreign companies that have a limited presence in the UK, knowing that they're not going to come into scope. So each SMS firm would have their own code of conduct. Some of them might be quite similar, but they would be bespoke for each firm because, as Ollie again Sorry, I'm agreeing with Ollie again. They are all very, very different from each other, and they you can't just lump, Apple in with Facebook or whatever. So the new regulator, the Digital Markets Unit, would have the power to suspend, block, and reverse decisions of the SMS firms and to order conduct to bring them into compliance with the code. Interim measures would be available to kind of hold the ring while an investigation was going on, so that serious harm could not materialize while the DMU is investigating. So that's the code of conduct. The second limb is the pro-competitive interventions. So where the code of conduct manages the market power and seeks to mitigate its effects, the second limb would seek to address the source of the market power to boost competition and make sure innovation flourishes. We came up with some examples of pro-competitive interventions that we think need serious consideration. For example, mandating interoperability between services, restricting the use of default positions, giving consumers greater control over their data, mandating data silos within large firms, and possibly mandating competitors' access to platforms' data. We're not saying all those need to be put in place tomorrow. We're saying they need to be considered, and the DMU needs to have the power to put them in place if the case is made for them. The third aspect is merger control. That's already been touched upon briefly. We're considering whether gatekeeper firms, SMS firms, should be subject to increased scrutiny of their acquisitions. There's been, as many of you know, there's been widespread concern about the sheer volume and nature of the acquisitions being done by the SMS firms, by big tech over the last few years. So we're considering expansion of the merger control regime. So lastly, where are we in the process? We published our report in July, as I said. Back in March, the government commissioned the Digital Markets Task Force, which I'm helping to lead, and we're doing it with Ofcom and the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO's input. We are due to issue our formal advice to government next month, and that will deal with the practical application and design of the new regime. And from there, we hope to proceed to legislation. So that's a very quick canter. Happy to discuss any of that in more detail.
Thanks, Tom. Time's running tight, so we'll see if we can crack on through a few questions. I just want to jump straight in on the one which was raised pretty much by all panelists, which is who's in scope and who's out of scope. On the one hand, you've got the UK SMS regime, which you stated. Ollie was talking about who's in and who's out. Probably a general assumption that the GAFA are in, but what's the next circle out? Will it be could it be a booking.com, or indeed could it be someone, if you're in the UK trying to sell a house, there might be one or two platforms, which is the only place that you can sell your house online. So, but they might not come under your UK revenue or under your threshold. So perhaps maybe I'll go to Michael first and then to Tom, just about how we define who's in scope and who's out. Michael.
Well, part of the problem, and that's where the fun bit about the geopolitics comes in, is that I think that the wagon is in front of the horses. So, having partaken indirectly in some of the discussions in Europe, I think that, there's a sense, certainly in some of the politicians driving it, that we know what the outcome is, and they're also bloody American. And now that the Brits are out, the French and the Germans are very happy to band together and would like to squash them. And that has created the momentum. And, it's fun, there's Syed and March was speaking about the garbage can model, where a problem meets a solution and the right conditions, and they all come together. That's it. There is a real problem. There is a problem of competition. On the other hand, the political impetus has to do with geopolitics. Brexit also helped, because part of the pragmatism of the Brits and the careful work of the CMA is, politely seen, but not necessarily center stage. And I think that you do see a slightly stronger hand. Now, I do think that we have some important issues that relate to excessive power, but unfortunately, this is now a little bit mingled. And I think that Booking.com may be inadvertently the one that's going to be sacrificed, because we're certainly not going to sacrifice SAP, because the Europeans would not like to have B2B in the firing line. And they said, no, we're going to have our own little kiddo, which is going to be called Gaia X. That's going to be the good, right European proper way of doing things. So I think that it's a little hard to speak about that totally extricating about the political realities that are bringing things to the fore. And the closer you are to some of the decision making, perhaps I've been, as an outsider, a little too close for comfort, and I don't terribly care because I'm not part of this particular group. So here's the more I think that you see part of that stuff. Now, I do think that it's a good opportunity, though, and I think that one of the things that's coming up, and there will be also much more discussion in the United States. The ideas I was presenting on gatekeepers, I guess I'm going to be speaking about with the DOJ. That's also starting to look long and hard, because they're like, we need to change our approach. There was a different report, which was from the House Judiciary Commission, which is not the representative of what the DOJ does. So you have to understand all the things that are there. Let me wrap that up to simply say that there is a layers of complexity in what is really driving the decisions. I think that we are broadly moving into an area where the scope is going to be managed by some sense of, it's the Judge Potter Stewart or whatever his name was, definition of pornography. I know it when I see it. What's a gatekeeper right now? The answer is I know it when I see it. I have not seen one paper doing it. I just finished writing one precisely because I have not seen one. But I think that we need to think much more carefully about these types of issues. We will be thinking more carefully over the next few months. Right now, I think that there's going to be some effort to deal with the issue because we see a huge amount of tipping and we do see some excessive power. And by the way, we see some of the big tech throwing some fairly cheap biscuits to the regulators to keep them quiet. Apple just said, oh, I'll cut my rates to 15%, not 30%, if you're really small and 1 million, and it's not going to cost me anything and it's going to be a good PR stunt. Google has done some sort of internally naughty things that went to the press, and the FT started gleefully noting it. So there's going to be exactly what you would expect in a situation like this one. So there's going to be politics. There's going to be the pragmatism of what drives it. And I think that the answer is big tech and then a couple of others, because otherwise we can't really justify it. And then we are going to start a discussion, hopefully informed by people of this community. And that's where I agree with Ole, because we need to have a bit more of a truth criterion and, some principles that underpin it, regardless of the hats that we have. Sorry, but too difficult a question to answer quickly.
No worries. No, not wishing to put Tom into the position of talking about politics or the B word and taking it down to more mundane, prosaic levels about the regulatory analysis. Would you just give you a chance to respond to that?
Yeah, I've been at enough conferences over the last 3 years. No, not to start talking about Brexit. Get into trouble very quickly. So I need to be slightly coy about exactly who will end up being subject to it. Certainly the GAFAM companies are obvious companies to consider. But we need to. The whole regime will fall on its face if you do the cart before the horse. You need to consider what problem are you trying to solve. And who represents that problem, and then decide what to do about it. Because if you do it the other way around, it's not going to work, is it? And it's also it's not good enough to start talking about regulating Apple, regulating Google. You need to think about exactly what within Google are you worried about, or what within Apple are you worried about. And so the way we're thinking of setting it up is where you consider it's not just the regime as a whole will apply to the corporate group, but actually the detail, which is the important bit, will apply to the designated activities that are found to have substantial and entrenched market power with a strategic position. And that wouldn't be, I wouldn't expect, we haven't done it yet, but I wouldn't expect that would be everything Google does or everything Apple does or everything Amazon does. It needs to be carefully and laid out in a very long and detailed document that everyone can read and see your reasoning. It needs to be evidence-led.
Thanks. Ollie, what's your response to that? You're facing different flavors and attempts to regulate both cases and legislation based in Europe, and then Tom's approach.
Look, I guess one reaction. I think that just very quickly, I have a lot of sympathy for the way Tom outlines things. The process during the market study was extremely rigorous, right, which has led to where we are today. Extremely rigorous. I may disagree with bits and pieces of the final report, but I can't fault it on the desire and executing on the kind of analysis that Tom was describing. That's very encouraging when you engage with the regulators. They're prepared to take their time. They're under a lot of pressure themselves, as we are. but they are prepared to take the time to think creatively about how to gather the evidence, which ultimately allows us to isolate the issues. And we may disagree on the issues, but I want to find them as quickly as I can, and that's a shared interest. The one observation I would say on this is that I am struck by the speed with which some of the procedures in Europe are moving, the regulatory procedures. And that does, as an in-house lawyer, does give you a sense of trepidation, I think. The sort of political impetus to move and to deliver regulatory reform, how one squares that with the desire to be rigorous and thorough in the way that we first of all set up the tools for analysis, then conduct the analysis sensibly on an expedited basis, no doubt, but sensibly, and then come to the conclusions. Google, you ought to do this, you ought to stop doing that. So I do wonder, one observation, I do wonder how the two things can be squared, because there's obviously a tension. Let's get this thing written and let's do it right.
Ole, I want you to answer your own question that you raised, which was, where do we draw the line between disruption and distortion? And you posed that for the other platforms listening in who might be trying to gain market share, trying to enter markets, trying to mix things up with a new product. But some of the approach to the GAFA would, such as the obligation to notify all of these mergers of very, very small things, or not even be allowed to enter neighboring markets. Does it make you feel as though you're not allowed to disrupt anymore, that everything that you would do to expand or in your eyes to innovate would be considered to be distortive?
That's a great, but big question. Look, I think that one of the things that is somewhat underestimated for when people think about how Google is operating is how closely we have followed, paid attention to, and continue to refer to big cases that we've been involved in. And the implications of those big cases, I think sometimes it's the sense is, at least the sort of rhetoric around it, is they take too long and nothing changes. They take a long time because they're complicated issues and because of various procedural events that happen along the course. There's a paper by two of our lawyers, Thomas Graf and Henry Mostyn, that talks about the history of some of the longer cases if you're interested. I think as part of that, we learn a tremendous amount. Have those cases led to a chilling of innovation, de-launching, block launches? Things have certainly slowed down when it comes to some of our search verticals. We have to be much more mindful of the framework that's been given to us for assessment in the shopping case. That's a fact of life. I think that the cases set out a rather clear table of contents, if you like, the inputs that the regulator is going to be considering when they look at a particular search vertical. And so for that, they also speed us up a little bit. I know what to look for, but I have to take the time to look for it and to discuss it internally. So that's really, look, I don't think we're yet at a point where Google is, that we're seeing a raft of blocked launches, but certainly the regulatory reform that's on the horizon, if not done properly, does have the potential to do that. If vertical integrations are blocked per se, if you happen to be a gatekeeper, clearly that will lead to, I think, pro-competitive innovations being blocked. So that's what we need to be careful, is to make sure that you take the evidence-based framework, which is what the shopping decision is, and you try and figure out from that, well, what can I do to expedite that kind of analytical process? What evidence is important? What have we learned from those kinds of processes? Because I suspect that you could make things run a lot faster without jettisoning an evidence-based approach. And that's my hope, optimistic hope for new reform.
I'll just put that thesis that hope, vain or otherwise, to Tom, which is a response to this sort of, risk that not done properly, there could be a chilling effect. You could put a halt on integration of things. If you go back 10 years, integration of maps into Google, there's a court case about whether that would be, nowadays would be anti-competitive, be seen as a new product launch, pushing other people out the market. What's your response to that?
Yeah, so the SMS, the gatekeeper platforms entering into new markets is a good thing. It's more competition in the new market. It's a matter of how that happens, and in the short term versus the long term. You may get an efficiency and a consumer benefit in the short term from something, from the large platform moving into a new market. But in the long term, if you look 5 years later, there's no one else competing because they've been pushed out because of the unfair advantages and whatever has happened on behalf of the platform. Then you could expect innovation to drop because it's an unassailable market. position that the platform has got. So it's really difficult, and if we do intervene badly, you could dampen innovation. We haven't yet drafted the codes of conduct. Well, we haven't yet designated people that would be subject to the code of conduct. So there's a way to go before we actually get there. But we'll certainly, I think that's why you need a principles-based regulation where you can get into the weeds and discuss these complex trade-offs, and you need to make your case if you're going to intervene.
Thanks. Our time is up, but I'm going to give the last 30 seconds to Michael to respond to that, and then we will hand it back to the
Well, I agree on the need to have principles-based. I would say, to complement what Ollie's saying, that we need not only evidence-based, but we need, to articulate the logic. Some of the things we will not need to have lengthy procedures to find out whether that something is wrong or not. We may decide some practices, for reasons that still are being discussed, are simply not good, or even if we think that should be allowed, it's this gray list idea that you can go ahead and do that, but you have to show us why this is not competitive. I think that is a reasonable set of practices. One of the best things that is coming out from the current DSA and NCT discussions in the European Union, and I hope will essentially change the burden of proof. Second, and related to that, and that relates to this community, I think that what I have been surprised at how lacking it is the input of people who make other smaller platforms. Now, for my sins, having worked for a number of years with people who are interested in building their own ecosystems, I now have a quasi-regulatory role as a chief digital advisor in one of the NRAs. And it's been surprising that I don't hear much of the evidence of the people who are the smaller platforms, which we would like to encourage, to say, well, what are the problems that you actually have, or what would make it more competitive in your view? And perhaps the CMA has had much more of that, but I haven't seen it in any systematic way. And I think that it'd be great to engage people from this community in order to have a more responsive policy. We cannot have the national regulatory agencies, or the European one or the American one, be the sole bottleneck. They can be the facilitators, but in a way we have to rethink the whole ecosystem, having a greater participation of the people who are in the coalface of trying to build these platforms and who see what is fair and unfair, that will connect much better to the regulators. So this is the hope, and that's the role that I think this community has to play.
Thank you very much, Michael. I just quickly thank Tom and Ollie as well for their input and the fruitful discussion. And we are a few minutes over, but we started a few minutes late. So thank you, and I'll hand back to Petra.
Thank you very much, Lewis, Michael, Ollie, and Tom. Fascinating, again, like the first panel, and definitely felt the passion about the topic that you guys displayed.